On February 28, 2022, 4 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, something happened that no country in the world had ever seen before. The United States and its allies froze $300 billion of Russia's own money. Not Russian private assets, not oligarch yachts. The sovereign reserves of the Russian central bank, money Russia had earned and saved over decades, was locked. Frozen, made completely inaccessible. And then, within days, major Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT, the messaging system that connects over 11,000 financial institutions across more than 200 countries. Russia could not pay for imports. It could not receive payments for exports through normal channels. Its financial system was severed from the global economy almost overnight. The ruble collapsed 30% in a single day. Interest rates were doubled to 20%. Russians lined up at ATMs, fearing their savings would be worthless by morning. This was not a military strike. No bombs fell. No troops crossed a border. This was financial warfare, and it was conducted entirely through the dollar. Here is the question that every finance ministry and central bank in the world began asking on February 28, 2022. If it happened to Russia, could it happen to us? That question is now reshaping the global financial order in ways that will play out for decades. It is accelerating a race to build alternative payment systems. It is pushing countries that have no particular love for Russia to quietly reduce their dollar exposure. It is funding a digital currency platform that most people have never heard of, and that could, in time, represent the most serious structural challenge to dollar dominance since Bretton Woods. This video will explain exactly how the dollar became a weapon, why it works, where it has limits, and what the world is building to escape it. Before we can understand dollar sanctions, we need to understand SWIFT. SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It was founded in 1973, headquartered in Belgium, and it does something deceptively simple. It sends messages. When a bank in Tokyo wants to send money to a bank in London, SWIFT transmits the secure, standardized message that makes that transaction possible. It is not itself a payment system. It is the communication layer that payment systems depend on. Think of it as the postal service of global finance. Every letter, every financial instruction passes through it. Today, SWIFT connects more than 11,000 financial institutions in over 200 countries. It processes tens of millions of messages every day. And because the dollar is the dominant currency in global finance, and because SWIFT is the infrastructure through which dollar transactions are communicated, being cut off from SWIFT is, in practical terms, being cut off from the dollar-based global economy. This is the crucial connection. SWIFT is not an American institution. It is technically a Belgian cooperative, overseen by the central banks of the G10 nations. But because the dollar sits at the center of global finance, and because almost every international transaction, in almost any currency, eventually passes through a bank that needs access to the dollar system, the United States has enormous leverage over SWIFT. In 2012, that leverage was first used as a major geopolitical weapon. Iran had been subject to American sanctions for decades. But in 2012, the Obama administration escalated dramatically. Congress passed legislation authorizing the president to sanction SWIFT itself, threatening the personal board members of the organization if it continued providing services to Iranian banks. SWIFT complied. Iranian banks were disconnected. The Iranian rial collapsed. Oil exports, which had to be paid for in dollars, became almost impossible to transact through normal banking channels. Iran's economy contracted sharply. The sanctions were specifically designed to bring Tehran to the negotiating table over its nuclear program. They worked. In 2015, Iran signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iranian banks were reconnected to SWIFT as part of the deal. Then, in 2018, President Trump withdrew from the agreement. Iranian banks were disconnected again. The message was clear. Access to the global financial system was now a diplomatic bargaining chip controlled by Washington. But here is what most analysts missed at the time. Iran is a mid-size economy. Its GDP is roughly $400 billion. Its integration into the global financial system was significant but not existential for other major economies. The world adjusted. Trade with Iran became difficult, but the damage was contained. Russia was an entirely different proposition. Russia is the world's largest country by land mass, the world's largest natural gas exporter, a top 3 global oil producer, a major supplier of wheat, fertilizer, nickel, palladium, and titanium to global industrial supply chains. And on February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within 4 days, the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, and their allies had deployed the most comprehensive financial sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. First, and most unprecedented, was the freezing of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves. Russia had spent years building what it called a fortress balance sheet, accumulating over $600 billion in foreign reserves specifically to withstand sanctions. The strategy was rational. No one had ever frozen a G20 country's central bank reserves before. It was assumed that sovereign reserves, money a country earned and stored in foreign financial systems, were protected by the implicit norms of international finance. Those norms were broken on February 28, 2022. Approximately $300 billion of Russia's reserves, the portion held in Western financial systems, primarily in Euroclear in Belgium, were frozen. Russia could see the money. It could not touch it. Second, Russian banks were expelled from SWIFT. Not all of them immediately, and not all at once, but progressively through 2022. The practical effect was that Russian financial institutions could no longer send or receive the standardized messages that enable international transactions. Payments for Russian energy exports became complicated. Payments for imports became nearly impossible through normal channels. The ruble fell. Inflation surged. International companies exited Russia en masse. Over 750 corporations announced suspension or withdrawal of Russian operations in the weeks following the invasion. The sanctions were the most powerful financial weapon ever deployed. And they revealed, with brutal clarity, the full extent of what dollar dominance actually means in practice. Now here is where the story gets genuinely complex. Because the sanctions worked, and they also didn't work. And understanding both of those things simultaneously is essential. In the short term, they were devastating. The ruble collapsed. Russian imports crashed. The technology supply chain was severed. The Russian economy shrank in 2022. But Russia did not collapse. And by 2023, its GDP had recovered to near pre-war levels. Why? 3 reasons. First, oil prices spiked after the invasion. Russia was still selling enormous volumes of oil and gas. It just redirected those flows eastward. China became Russia's largest trading partner, accounting for over 25% of Russian trade by 2024. India dramatically increased its purchases of discounted Russian crude. The revenue kept flowing, just through different pipes. Second, Russia had built parallel infrastructure. After the lighter sanctions imposed following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia had developed its own domestic payment messaging system, the SPFS, as a backup to SWIFT. It was limited in international reach, connecting mainly Russian banks and exporters. But it existed. Russia also deepened its integration with China's CIPS system, the cross-border interbank payment system, which can settle international transactions in yuan. Third, and most importantly, the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions on countries that helped Russia evade Western sanctions created a constraint that could not always be enforced. China is so deeply integrated into the dollar system, its central bank holds over $1 trillion in U.S. assets, its banks depend on dollar correspondent banking, that the threat of secondary sanctions caused Chinese financial institutions to pull back from Russia-related transactions repeatedly, throughout 2023 and 2024, but trade found ways. Non-financial channels, barter arrangements, third country intermediaries. Russia survived. The war continued, and the sanctions, while genuinely costly, demonstrated both the enormous power of the dollar weapon and its real-world limitations against a large, resource-rich, strategically positioned adversary. But here is the consequence that matters most, and that will outlast the war itself. February 28, 2022, sent a message to every government in the world that was not already a close U.S. ally. The message was this: your reserves, held in Western financial systems and denominated in dollars, are not safe. They can be frozen, they can be seized. The rules that everyone assumed protected sovereign assets, those rules no longer apply. And that message changed behavior immediately. Central banks around the world began buying gold at record rates. The World Gold Council reported record central bank gold purchases in 2022 and 2023. Countries that had never seriously considered reducing dollar exposure began modeling what it would look like. Saudi Arabia, America's oldest petrodollar partner, held discussions with China about accepting yuan for oil sales. ASEAN finance ministers discussed regional currency settlement arrangements. Brazil's President Lula publicly questioned why global trade must be conducted in dollars. These were not random coincidences. They were direct responses to the demonstration of how dollar dominance could be weaponized. And China, which had been building its alternative financial infrastructure quietly for a decade, accelerated everything. The platform at the center of this acceleration is called mBridge. Most people have never heard of it. They should. mBridge, which stands for Multiple Central Bank Digital Currency Bridge, is a digital payment platform built on blockchain technology that allows central banks to settle cross-border transactions directly with each other, in their own digital currencies, without using the dollar, without using SWIFT, and without any intermediary that could be subject to U.S. sanctions pressure. The project began in 2021, developed in collaboration with the Bank for International Settlements, the Central Bank of Central Banks, alongside the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia joined in 2024. In October 2022, the first real value pilot was conducted. 160 transactions, $22 million settled among 20 commercial banks across 4 jurisdictions. By mid-2024, the platform reached what technologists call minimum viable product status, meaning it was functional at real commercial scale. By January 2026, mBridge had processed over 4,000 cross-border transactions with a cumulative value of approximately $55 billion. China's digital yuan, the ECNY, accounts for roughly 95% of settlement volume on the platform. And in October 2024, in one of the most revealing moments in recent international financial history, the Bank for International Settlements quietly withdrew from the mBridge project. Why? Because the 16th BRICS Summit had discussed creating a BRICS bridge, a version of mBridge that would explicitly allow BRICS nations to settle trade among themselves without dollar intermediation, and potentially to bypass U.S. sanctions. The BZ, which is fundamentally a Western-aligned institution, was not comfortable being part of infrastructure that could be used for sanctions evasion. So it left. And mBridge continued, now operated entirely by the participating central banks, without BI's oversight, without Western institutional involvement. Think about what that means. There is now a functioning cross-border payment platform, processing real transactions at scale, between China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, and Thailand, completely outside the dollar system, and the institution that was supposed to ensure its neutrality has walked away. Now let's apply the three-economy lens. For the United States, the dollar weapon is genuinely powerful. The sanctions on Russia were the most comprehensive financial assault ever mounted on a major economy. They isolated Russia from Western capital markets, froze its central bank assets, and forced it into a costly reorientation of its entire trade and financial architecture. For smaller economies, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, dollar sanctions have been existentially damaging, preventing normal trade and forcing constant improvisation. But the weapon has a cost. Every time it is used aggressively, it accelerates the motivation of other countries to build the infrastructure to escape it. The United States is spending down the reputational capital of dollar dominance, using it for geopolitical goals in ways that make every non-aligned country in the world recalculate their exposure. For China, the 2022 sanctions on Russia were both a warning and an instruction manual. A warning, because China knows that in any future confrontation over Taiwan, it would be the target of far more severe sanctions than Russia faced. Its exposure to the dollar system is enormous. Its central bank holds over $1 trillion in U.S. assets. Its major banks depend on correspondent banking relationships that require dollar access. An instruction manual, because Russia's experience showed exactly where the gaps in Western financial infrastructure are. China is building systematically to exploit every one of them. CIPS, the yuan-based payment messaging system, now processes transactions from over 100 countries. mBridge provides the settlement layer. Belt and road trade networks create the commercial relationships that can be denominated in yuan. The digital yuan provides the payment instrument that can operate without Western financial intermediaries. China is not trying to replace the dollar overnight. It is building a parallel system, one that gives enough countries enough alternatives that the dollar weapon becomes less effective with each passing year. For Iran, the sanctions have been devastating for the civilian economy but have not changed the government's fundamental behavior. Inflation has been chronic. Access to medicines and technology has been restricted. But Iran has survived for over 4 decades under varying levels of dollar sanctions. It has developed shadow shipping fleets to move oil. It has built barter arrangements with China and Russia. It has pioneered the techniques of sanctions evasion that Russia subsequently adopted. The lesson of Iran is uncomfortable for sanctions advocates. Long-term comprehensive sanctions on a determined government rarely achieve their stated political goals. They impose enormous suffering on civilian populations. They generate enormous creativity and evasion. And they provide a model, adopted by Russia, studied by China, for how to survive outside the dollar system. Now here is the deep insight. The dollar's role as a weapon is fundamentally in tension with its role as a reserve currency. A reserve currency must be trusted by all countries, friend and adversary alike. Central banks in Riyadh, Beijing, Jakarta, and Brasilia must believe that dollars they hold today will still be accessible tomorrow, regardless of political circumstances. That trust is the foundation on which the dollar's reserve status rests. But every time the United States weaponizes the dollar, freezing reserves, expelling banks from SWIFT, imposing secondary sanctions, it erodes exactly that trust. It demonstrates that the dollar is not a neutral store of value. It is a political instrument controlled by one government. The paradox is this: the more effectively America uses the dollar as a weapon, the more it motivates the rest of the world to build the infrastructure to escape it. The weapon is self-defeating over the long run. Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman at Georgetown University, two of the leading scholars of economic statecraft, coined the phrase weaponized interdependence to describe this dynamic. States that sit at the hub of global economic networks can use their structural position to coerce others. But the act of coercion itself incentivizes the targeted states to reduce their dependence on the hub. The weapon fires and simultaneously begins dismantling the conditions that made it work. This is the fundamental tension the United States now faces. It has the most powerful financial weapon in history. Every time it uses it, the weapon works in the short term and weakens in the long term. Let us pull the 3 core ideas together. The dollar became a weapon through a specific evolution. SWIFT, technically a Belgian cooperative, became an extension of American financial power because the dollar sits at the center of global finance. Every institution that needs dollar access needs SWIFT. America's control over SWIFT is indirect but overwhelming. Dollar sanctions work, and they have real limits. Against Russia, they froze $300 billion in reserves, severed banking connections, and forced a massive economic reorientation. They did not collapse the Russian economy or stop the war. Against smaller economies like Iran and North Korea, they have been more comprehensively damaging, but also produced decades of adaptation and evasion innovation. The February 2022 sanctions were a turning point, not because they failed, but because they succeeded so visibly. Every government in the world that is not firmly within the U.S. alliance structure now knows that their dollar reserves are a liability as much as an asset. That knowledge is funding mBridge, CIPS, gold purchases, UN invoicing, and a dozen other parallel financial infrastructure projects. The war for a new financial order has begun, and it will be fought not on battlefields but on blockchains, in central bank conference rooms, and in the architecture of payment systems that most people will never see. The dollar remains dominant, but for the first time since Bretton Woods, the world has a concrete, functioning, geopolitically motivated reason to build something different. And it is building it, right now. The next video in this series asks the question that follows naturally from everything we have covered. If the dollar is losing its exclusive grip on global finance, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, who fills the vacuum? What does a genuinely multipolar financial world actually look like? And is it more stable than the one we have? Or more dangerous? That is a harder question than most people realize. And the answer will surprise you.